Let me introduce our guest tonight, Justin Brierley. He's a freelance writer, speaker, and broadcaster. He's worked in radio, podcast, and video for over 2 decades, and he's become known for creating dialogues between Christians and non-Christians, having fascinating conversations around faith, science, theology, and culture, and we read about some of those. I think basically you have the best job in the world. And Justin currently co-hosts the Reenchanting podcast as a guest presenter for Maybe God podcast, and has recently launched the podcast documentary series called The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, which is the title of his latest book that we just finished reading and discussing. And Justin is married to Lucy, a church minister in Surrey, which I believe is a county about half an hour south of London.
Yes, that sounds right. Yeah, that's correct.
I had a girlfriend who lived there, so I should be sort of in the neighborhood. And they have 4 amazing children. Welcome to Girl Talk Apologetics, Justin.
Wow, thank you. And thank you for accommodating me at an unusual time as well. Very kind of you. Any late than your normal time would have been about 1 a.m. for me. So this is more convenient.
Right. No, we appreciate it. So why don't we just launch right into the questions? Patty, I'm the Patty Trotty. Why don't you put up your hand, Patty? And I are the guest hosts, the co-founders of Girl Talk Apologetics, and we will be sort of passing back and forth, rotating off, asking you questions. I will start off. So who have been your favorite interview subjects and why? And maybe you can share sort of a memorable moment from one of your dialogues with these guests that weren't in the book.
Yes, gosh, well, there are so many to choose from. And I sometimes say it's like asking me to choose between my children, all of those many shows over the years. Two that particularly stand out. And in fact, I think arguably both might be referenced in the book somewhere. But one of the most exciting episodes that I think I had the privilege of recording was a debate between the historian Tom Holland and the atheist philosopher A.C. Grayling. And that was particularly interesting because in a sense, it wasn't the normal format in as much as neither guest particularly claimed to be a Christian. And normally my shows are set up as, Christian, non-Christian dialogue. But in this case, I felt it was important to bring them together because Tom Holland, although he wasn't claiming a Christian faith in the show, was nevertheless making a very significant argument for the importance of Christian faith in the West. And many of you may be familiar with his book, which I talk about in my own book, Dominion. And so he's been at the forefront of really making the case for the way in which Christianity has essentially shaped the moral instincts of the West and sort of sounding the alarm for what may happen in the absence of that story, whether we can hold on to these values of, intrinsic dignity, human rights, compassion, freedom, progress, and so on, without the Christian story that essentially grounds them. So I had him in conversation with an atheist philosopher, A.C. Grayling, who's quite well known, who had himself at the time recently published his own sort of philosophical tome, which was a history of philosophy. And he began his book by really sort of trashing the idea that Christianity ever did anything good for us. He began in the introductory chapter of his book by saying essentially that Christians had trashed antiquity, that they had essentially, meant that the early church in the Middle Ages had sort of taken away so much classical learning and literature and so on. And so that really set the stage for a really interesting opening debate between the two when I brought them on to debate Tom's thesis that essentially, we owe our morality to the Christian faith. Because the first 20 or 30 minutes were really taken up with debating whether, as A.C. Grayling claimed, Christians had trashed antiquity. And it was a very guilty pleasure of mine, really, to see A.C. Grayling really taken to the woodshed to some extent by this historian who really sort of just kept asking, well, where's your evidence for this? And producing evidence quite to the contrary, that in fact Christians had been the ones who, through monastic learning centers, had actually been able to preserve and copy and pass on a lot of those ancient classical texts. So that was very interesting, and partly it was because it was such a sparky encounter between two, very significant voices, that I felt I was in an amazingly privileged position to be able to host this and to, and it was a very energetic, interesting conversation, and one that I think did go far and wide, and was really just at the beginning of an increasing trajectory for Tom Holland, as he's become highly influential now with this thesis of his. So I was very glad to be there, sort of, when that one happened. On the other end of the spectrum, if I can add one more, that was a very sort of combative kind of debate. I remember that same year hosting another conversation, this time on stage in the USA. I think I was in California at the time, and we were hosting a conference and a dialogue evening. And this time it was Professor John Lennox, who some of you may know of as a sort of Oxford professor of mathematics and philosophy of science. And he's a wonderful Christian thinker and communicator. And I had him in conversation with Dave Rubin, who is a sort of YouTube talk show host, essentially. He's got a very popular channel. Dave Rubin, at that point, I think would have described himself as sort of agnostic Jewish, essentially. And I was able to bring those together, and we had about, probably getting on for about 1,000 people in the audience, and it was a really fascinating conversation between the two of them, because it went well beyond just a sort of intellectual sparring and to and fro. Dave Rubin really proved himself to be very, very open to faith, and I think it was at a moment in his life, having been very influenced by Jordan Peterson, where he was open to investigating Christianity even. And so it was lovely to be in the middle of that conversation, which was very warm, quite funny at points, and kind of, because there was a live audience, had an interesting dynamic too. And just to see John's natural charisma coming through, and just his winsome nature, really right there on stage, just being a wonderful example of how to do really good dialogue. And so that remains a favorite of mine, because it was the closest I've ever seen the non-Christian sort of really come very close to sort of wanting to take it further, wanting to really go on a journey towards Christian faith. So that was very memorable as well.
That's interesting. I haven't heard that one. I did listen to the one with AC Grayling, and yeah, you're right about being pressed. That was
Yes.
quite great. And we've mentioned several times, or at least I have, during reading this and discussing your book, recommending Tom Holland's Dominion. I read it over the summer, and it's really read like a fast-paced novel.
Yeah, it's a wonderful read.
All right.
All right, our next question was submitted by Donna, and she is with us here today. And she asks, as a postmodern society with many people not believing in such a thing as absolute truth, will our apologetics that are based on scientific evidences for God lose their power? Will scientific apologetics be focused on yesterday's objections?
It's a great question, Patty. I mean, interestingly, I think there is still a place for that classical evidential apologetics, because I don't think truth is such a sort of postmodern thing these days, that there aren't a good number of people for whom actually science and evidence and rational argument is still persuasive. Though I think you're absolutely right. We do live in a very kind of postmodern way of thinking about things, where a lot of people say, well, you have your truth and I have my truth, and so on. And it can feel like you're sort of trying to nail jello to a wall if you're having a conversation with someone like that, where they don't, they just want to say, well, you can have your opinion and I can have my opinion, and everything else. I think inevitably apologetics, you always have to, choose a strategy that works for the person that you're talking to. If I'm talking to someone who is a sort of engineering type, a scientific type, or whatever, then I tend to find they get quite engaged and interested in those more sort of rational scientific sort of evidences for God from the universe and so on. If I'm talking to someone who is more of a potentially an activist, someone who maybe is very pluralistic in sort of, you know, wants to kind of say that everyone has their own truth and so on, I think you have to start from somewhere quite different. I think often they're not actually that interested in those sorts of evidences. And you're probably going to have to find the thing that is important to that person. You know, if I'm thinking of someone who, you know, even if they may not be that interested in those sorts of questions of truth, they may still have a real sense that actually some things are important, like love for your family. That may be an important value to them. It may be it may be art, it may be literature, it may be something that they value. And I think that can also be a good starting point, apologetically speaking. You can start to have a conversation about, well, why do we value family? Why do we value what is it? Is it a purely, you know, biochemical reaction, or is love something more than that? And you know, most people I think will say that it is more than that. And then you can hopefully start to tease that out and ask, well, where does this come from? Where, you know, ultimately, I do think one of the things I say in the book is that I do think, by and large, the church probably does need to, and Christian apologists do need to change tack to some extent in the era we're living in, because a lot of those conversations that did revolve around those big objections and debates of the new atheist era, I think have kind of rather passed now. And I don't think most people are waking up in the morning saying, give me 3 philosophical evidences for God. They're usually waking up in the morning saying, well, give me a reason to get out of bed, you know, because they're living with, I think these days, most people are living with very existential questions about meaning and purpose and identity. And so I think the way to engage those questions isn't to go straight for the classical apologetics, but is to engage the imagination. This is something I talk about in the final chapter of the book, and that people are still, you know, there's still lots of ways in, but very often you have to begin at a different place and engage, you know, more something of their longings and their passions and their desires, or even their sense of emptiness. You know, that's often where people are beginning these days, and that may involve becoming a bit more creative. It may involve sort of making them wish that this story were true before you can show them that it is, and that can come through lots of different ways. It could be that you know, the common ground you have is a shared love of music or art or whatever, and if you can sort of find a way in which to show that the Christian story is somehow, that there's an echo of the Christian story in this love that they have for their family, and that the emotion that piece of music engenders in them, in the films they love, you know, which, you know, usually simply echoing again the great themes of love and sacrifice, redemption, and so on. I think those are probably the place where we begin to build our case that actually they want the Christian story to be true, that actually they're still longing for that. But that's not it. Sometimes that's a bit harder work. We have to think a little bit more imaginatively in doing so than to simply, you know, break open the Kalam cosmological argument or whatever it may be. So having said all that, you know, I do think often once someone's starting to go on that journey, I do think there are, you know, traditional apologetics still has its role, because often it's once people are kind of engaged with the possibility of Christianity that they then do have those intellectual questions. And very often apologetics can be great for removing some of the roadblocks around, you know, can I trust the Bible? What do I do about suffering? Those sorts of classic questions. So yeah, I hope that's helpful as a response.
Yes. And I think finding common ground and being aware of where the other person is coming from is very important, regardless of the approach that we're using, as you were saying.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no one size fits all. And inevitably, for me, the most engaging form of evangelism is always still going to be personal and relational, and just being there for the person, you know, in the end.
Thank you.
So speaking of using imagination, I'm going to give you a hypothetical scenario. So an atheist, a radical postmodernist, and a New Testament scholar whose faith has lapsed into agnosticism walk into a pub together. There they spy Justin Brierley, presumably still sober, alone at a table for four, and they join him. They ask him about the existence of God and the divinity of Jesus. Would this have to be three separate conversations, or is there a way you could communicate with all of them in a way they would find meaningful and possibly convincing?
Wow, gosh, what a question. I've never had it put to me like that before. So the three are an atheist, a radical postmodernist, and a sort of lapsed
Christian.
Bible scholar who, yeah, okay. Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, inevitably, I think you are going to be ending up having some side conversations that specifically encompass their particular objection or skepticism around Christianity. And to that extent, I think, yeah, I'd want to kind of take each one in turn. I think there probably are some, you know, we could get going, certainly, I think, in a conversation like that. Well, I mean, the obvious place, you know, where I would start a conversation like that is tell me about yourselves. You know, I'd want to hear all of their stories, and I'd want to tell my story. And I'd want to sort of lay on the table, you know, put my cards out there to why I'm a Christian, that it's obviously at one level, it's a personal thing. It's because of experiences I've had, but that I have gone on this journey of discovering that there are also objective reasons why it makes sense to believe that there's a God and that God has spoken to us through Jesus Christ. And I think each of them are going to probably have very different responses to that, you know, me laying my cards on the table in that way. But I think you that's probably the place to begin is to some extent just telling your story and allowing the person then to respond with what resonates or what doesn't, you know, in that case. I think perhaps one other tack you could take, regardless of where someone's coming from, is to make the point that we all come to life with a worldview, and that's probably well demonstrated by the three people you've chosen there, and that none of us are neutral observers, as it were, that we all have to give an account, you know, of the hope or the lack of hope that we have in our lives. And that's been really helpful for me, especially as I've hosted a lot of these conversations between Christians and atheists. It was coming to the realization that sometimes that an atheist would come on and expect the Christian to have to do all the hard work, all the heavy lifting of the burden of evidence and proof, assuming that they had no such burden of proof themselves. But in fact, most of the atheists I've met and who have come on my shows have subscribed to some form of naturalism, materialism. And that actually has all kinds of interesting consequences and is certainly a worldview that needs defending. And so I'm going to have plenty of my own questions for that person, but just kind of putting it on the table that actually we all believe something about life and we all need to make a defense of that. I think that's a helpful starting point because it helps people to realize that, you know, yes, Justin is here presenting his case for Christianity, but I equally have a responsibility for explaining why I believe what I believe. And it won't do to just say, well, you know, I don't really have any beliefs. I just don't think that's true of most people. So that might be a helpful way in as well.
All right. Thank you.
All right, the next question is from Kristen, who is with us right now. And she says, when you talked to Alex O'Connor, he suggested the rebirth seems more like a rebirth of utility in religion. We've seen several public figures claim to be cultural Christians, and we also see the United Nations working on the idea of a one world religion because they too know there is a utility in religion. Do you have any concern that this rebirth is a precursor to some kind of Gnostic theosophical one world religion, Or do you feel you are seeing the biblical and historical authenticity of Christianity in the incoming tide? In effect, how much of the wrong God might be mixed into this incoming tide?
Another wonderful question, and I'm so glad that you've been tracking some of the conversations I've been having around the book, Kristen. Um, I do think that's a really important issue that Alex raised there, and one which has been raised by many others as I've sort of put this thesis out via the book and the podcast series, because inevitably a lot of the people who are gravitating towards the importance and the value of faith are to some extent coming at it from a cultural political angle. And you even have people like Richard Dawkins, you know, the world's foremost atheist, describing himself as a cultural Christian earlier this year. And I think that's a really good example of what Alex is talking about there, which is people recognizing the social utility of religion. You know, Richard Dawkins would rather have Christianity than Islam, for instance. He thinks it's a better, you know, he doesn't believe it's true, but he believes it can be quite good for culture, actually. He likes the cathedrals and the carols and the things of that nature that it produces. Of course, there's a fundamental sort of what's the word? Conflict at the heart of that, which is that if you go around trying to persuade people not to be Christians, as Richard Dawkins has done for the last 20 years, you won't have any of those nice benefits of Christianity, unfortunately. But the point is, I think there are a number of people who are sort of mixed in with this movement, who are, yes, opening up to the value of Christianity, but primarily for sort of cultural reasons of that sort. And yes, you could almost see some people wanting to import some kind of deistic version of religion that just keeps the masses, you know, in line because of its social utility, but isn't really concerned about whether it's true or not. And I think that's a great danger in this. I think we are seeing some political manifestations of this on both the left and right, where people sort of try to adopt Christianity as their thing, but it's more, they're doing it more because they want to sort of co-opt it for a particular political purpose than because they really believe it themselves. And I think, again, that's a danger. Having said that, I think there's a spectrum, and I find people who are somewhere in the middle who, yes, recognize the social value of Christianity and they would like society to adopt more Christian values, but they also are very intrigued and attracted to Christian faith as well. And I could, you know, the aforementioned Tom Holland might fit that box, where he's very much been on this intellectual journey, recognizing the value of Christianity to the West, but has also, you know, been on something of a spiritual journey as well. And I think sort of sometimes hovers on the edge of belief, but I think essentially would really like to be a Christian, and to some extent arguably is, in as much as he does attend church regularly and, you know, is a communicant member of his Anglican church. So and then you've got people who have really, you know, come out and said, yeah, look, I am a Christian. I've been baptized. I'm on that thing. And one good example of that is Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who some of you may have heard the story of, and I featured again in the podcast series. But you know, from having been probably the world's best known female atheist, you know, just a year ago, she had this, you know, extraordinary conversion, which, yes, had a political, cultural dimension to it, because she came to be essentially converted intellectually by the Tom Holland thesis that we need Christianity in the West. We need that story to be able to hold on to Christian values. But she also went through a personal crisis, which led to her eventually turning to prayer and going to church. And she says it's transformed her life. And I know that she and her husband, Neil Ferguson, were both baptized a month or two ago. And so it's so I think there's you know, there's lots of people on this spectrum. Some have slightly more cynical, utilitarian motives. Others are sort of somewhere in the middle, and others are jumping in. And in my view, we need to be very careful that we're not sort of endorsing everything that's going on here. But in the end, I sort of have likened it to the parable of the wheat and the tares, and that God sows and up comes a harvest, and there's going to be good and bad manifestations of it, wheat and weeds. And ultimately God will reap his harvest, and he will be the one to judge, the motivations of hearts and that sort of thing. I think the church does, though, need to be very careful to always be pointing people to Jesus in this, not to trying to recapture some quote unquote Christian civilization. Christian civilization is a wonderful byproduct of the people who believed and acted in the name of Jesus, but that's to try and capture the one without the other is a doomed quest, in my opinion.
Right. That's not the primary goal, for sure.
Mm.
Okay, so you interview people who are already, intellectuals, essentially, who are already thinking deep thoughts about the reality of nature, whether they're Christians or non-Christians. Might this rebirth of belief you've been tracking be limited to intellectuals, or do you have any sense from your life or your ear to the ground that this is something that there's a turn in society at street level?
Another great question, and I've been asked a similar one at various points, and I do think that it's worth bearing in mind that a lot of the intellectuals I'm speaking of, they do have vast audiences. They're not simply locked away in ivory towers publishing books that only get read by a few intelligent people. These are people with huge podcasts, YouTube channels, filling auditoriums. So I think there is a genuine trickle down effect from some of these interesting names and characters who are having a really outsized influence on their audiences, many of whom are the regular man and woman on the street. Inevitably, I think the people who follow them tend to be themselves on the more kind of engaged end. They tend to be more educated. Perhaps they're in that sort of mode, period of life where they're asking some of these types of questions of themselves. And it's no, it's no secret that many of the people who have been most affected and influenced by people like Jordan Peterson, for instance, are young men, often young men of my age or a bit younger, Gen Z, millennials, and I think that is because there is what I would say is a sort of male identity crisis that's grown up in the West, where a lot of young men simply don't know how they're meant to be in the world. They don't really have a model for it any longer. All of the categories have been shaken up, and so when someone like Jordan Peterson comes along and sort of dispenses really what often is just really common sense advice, but then points them back to Scripture as a place from which they might draw meaning and purpose and identity. I think that's very interesting. I think not that I agree with everything Jordan Peterson ever says, but I do think it's worth noting the impact he's had on that demographic. And I have seen lots of people, especially these young men, who have started to take Christianity far more seriously, who he's sort of opened an intellectual door to be able to take it more seriously. So I do think that it's not just happening up here, it's filtering down. But then even beyond that, I also think this spiritual hunger is just a common human experience. And even though a lot of the examples I focus on tend to come from this slightly more intellectual space, actually, I think that there just is a growing meaning crisis that's manifesting across all demographics, and especially young people, actually. And when I look at the statistics around Gen Z, especially, they are the most non-religious generation, but they're also the most open to spirituality. That's going off in lots of different esoteric directions a lot of the time. But nonetheless, I think there's an enormous opportunity, because actually, I think a lot of them are ready to hear the Christian story again, because they're burned out, frankly. They're depressed, they're confused by the current culture, and it's not sustainable for much longer. So I think that's why, interestingly, when I look at the move, but there's a real move among a certain segment of both young men and young women back to a much more kind of orthodox traditional form of faith, because they're looking for that stability and that kind of foundation in what is otherwise just a crazy culture, basically, at the moment.
Anne asked you about your favorite interview subjects. I would like to know what has been the most challenging interview you've had so far, and whether there's ever been a time when you were so taken aback by someone else's words that you had to reevaluate your own beliefs.
Gosh, yeah, these are great questions. I there have certainly been at various points in my broadcasting career points where I was challenged on certain questions and within certain debates over issues I'd never really had the opportunity to really look into and sort out for myself. And one of the ones that comes to mind is back in 2009, I think it would have been, possibly 2010, when I first had on an edition of my Unbelievable show, the Bible scholar Bart Ehrman, who some of you may be familiar with, as a sort of skeptical New Testament scholar who himself lost his faith partly through a kind of more progressive liberal attitude towards the Bible that emerged, but ultimately it was the problem of evil and suffering that turned him towards agnosticism. And the first time I had him on the show was to debate his at the time best-selling book, Misquoting Jesus, which cast a lot of doubt on whether the New Testament records had been accurately preserved in the transmission over, many, many copies and so on over the years. And when I first read that book, I had a couple of sleepless nights because I thought, gosh, this guy has some really cogent arguments against the reliability of Scripture. But there's I'm pretty sure there's a proverb that says something like, when one person presents their case, it seems certain, then the other comes and suddenly it's not so certain. I'm paraphrasing that terribly, but the point is that I had only read one side of this at that point, and when I brought on the other guest, Peter J. Williams, quite a well-known Cambridge Bible scholar, he was able to really put things into context and point out the way in which a lot of what Bart does in that book, which is written at a popular level, is quite rhetorical, and there's a certain amount of casting things in a certain light, let's say. And Peter J. Williams' point that he made in this show was what Bart sort of represents as a glass half empty approach to Scripture, I would say is a glass half full approach. We've got the same facts in front of us, but I see that there is an incredibly strong witness to the historicity and reliability of these documents, whereas Bart wants to kind of cast it all as being in question. And actually, through Peter's sort of work and his responses and reading some other material around it, I came to realize actually that it's the very fact we have so many manuscripts, that we have so many copies, and inevitably because of that, you have so many variants and, transcribal errors and so on. But it's the very fact we have so many of them that makes it possible to retrieve the original text actually to 99.9% accuracy, which puts the New Testament head and shoulders above anything else from the ancient world. So for Bart to sort of write a whole book questioning, it's like you've got to take it in its context. And in the end, as Peter J. Williams pointed out, the actual number of passages that Bart in the end calls into question are about 4 or 5. And he has an opinion on what the correct reading is of them anyways. And none of them make any difference whatsoever to any fundamental Christian teaching. So it was one of those sort of scenarios where I really did feel like I had a completely different experience by the time I came out of that whole process to the one I went in with. But yeah, you have often those are quite, that it takes you out of your comfort zone when you're first presented with some of these issues. And I'm not saying that every issue gets, perfectly solved by any stretch. There's still lots of arguments and objections that I don't claim to have all the answers for. I've come to where I kind of land in the end. But yeah, that would just be one example where there was a sort of, a definite sort of intake as I launched myself into that particular one. It's some time ago now, and as you once you've kind of gone through that process, it helps you to sort of start to reframe the way you approach a lot of things when it comes to Scripture. You inevitably, the way you understand the text changes over time, and you gain, I think, a deeper appreciation of this, perhaps, that does need to replace a more simplistic understanding that perhaps you begin with. And that's true of everything in life, isn't it, really? So so anyway, that's the story that comes to mind on that question.
Yes, we can gain deeper understanding and more confidence too in what we believe. The next question is from Kristen, and she says, the converts you discuss are academic people who are often influenced by C.S. Lewis, who is very good at touching on the imagination. Have you interviewed many non-academic people, and if so, in what ways have you seen their imaginations touched?
Yes, I would say that I've increasingly been able to interview people who aren't necessarily academics necessarily. Though often being an academic doesn't exclude being imaginative, and some of them Lewis was obviously an amazing academic as well as being this extraordinary storyteller. And I find that some of the most interesting people are people who combine the two of those. I really enjoy the poetry of Malcolm Guite, for instance, who is a Cambridge fellow and chaplain, and extraordinarily gifted, in his knowledge of English literature and everything else, but has a wonderful way with words. And really, I think his poetry, for people who enjoy poetry, is a wonderful gateway into Christian faith. Likewise, someone I talk about towards the end of the book, Paul Kingsnorth, I think is an amazing poet and writer, and his own journey towards Christian faith as an adult in the last several years, I think, was to some extent came through the imagination. It came through a sense that actually he encountered a world where he encountered transcendence in beauty, in nature, in poetry, in art. And the way he put it to me was that he, having tried to be an atheist and failed sort of as a teenager, he kind of went on to become a Buddhist, hoping to find sort of the sense of the transcendent by looking inward. But that didn't work out either. It wasn't that it was a completely negative experience, but he said in the end he felt like he needed to worship something. He had this need almost that flowed out of him, and so he tried to worship nature itself. He became a Wiccan for 3 or 4 years, doing sort of nature rituals in the woods. But again, he said he discovered it was not the thing. That was not. It was a kind of. It was just a bit of a parody, really, of what in the end he discovered was sort of Christian heresy and New Age practices, basically. And he was as surprised as anyone when he finally found himself being drawn towards Christian faith, because he thought he knew what it was and he'd rejected it in his teenage years. But once he found the real thing, once he discovered the true story, once I think he started reading people like C.S. Lewis, interestingly, that really suddenly captured him. And all kinds of, interesting experiential things happened alongside that. His wife out of the blue one day saying, you're going to become a Christian. And he sort of reacted with, some great skepticism to that idea. But he did become a Christian, and that also involved dreams that he was having, where he was being confronted with the person of Christ. And so I think, there's, I do sense that there's a lot going on at the imaginative level for people, and I think even among many scientific types, actually, they even Richard Dawkins can be moved by a wonderful piece of choral music. I was at a discussion event on Friday night in London, which included cosmic skeptic Alex O'Connor and a few other people. And Alex had said he'd been at an evensong in Oxford a week or two previously, and he'd bumped into Richard Dawkins there as well. And he said, "Oh, you're here?" And Dawkins says, "Yes, I quite often come along to evensong." And there was a sort of joke in the room about, where is this church, which is almost entirely populated by atheists in Oxford. But the point is, both of them, they they find themselves drawn towards beauty, and there is something very beautiful, in that tradition. Um, I suppose the question is at what point people are willing to allow it to be, yeah, to see that is an echo of that has its origin in something that really exists. It's not just a psychological, neurological response to something. And I think, as I said, I think sometimes it's experience. It has to come along with something like an experience. Very often it's a crisis moment in people's lives that finally pushes them into seeing this as a reality. It's often some kind of an emotional experience. Yeah. So anyway, that's what I would say to that one.
Okay, so you mentioned both Tom Holland, Jordan Peterson, and you mentioned that some of these people are filling, auditoriums. Jordan Peterson will be in my neighborhood here in Southern California in February, and he is filling the Honda Center, which is where the Anaheim Ducks play, like 18,000 people.
Wow.
I mean, and that's probably not even his biggest venue for all I know. So I guess my question is, given the high demand for figures like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson as speakers, due to their really unique insight as, their sort of outsider perspective on Christianity, do you think, I mean, this is speculation, obviously, but do you think maybe they might have an awareness of their cash value in this space, and that might hinder their potential journey towards becoming Christians, if you know what I mean?
I think that's more than possible. I can imagine that Tom Holland, I think, is very pro-Christianity, and I think he sees Christianity as the best thing that, his fellow countrymen in the West could sort of adopt as a way of sort of seeing culture flourish and overcome some of the problems it has. And I suspect he probably does realize that sometimes people are more willing to listen to someone on the outside than on the inside. I couldn't say exactly whether that means he's sort of, putting off the inevitable, or whether he may, have even made the leap but doesn't necessarily broadcast it. But Jordan Peterson's a bit different. I do sense with him that there is still a sort of an intellectual barrier. And I think that's partly because he's conceived of God in such psychological Jungian terms. I think it's sometimes possible to have thought about something so deeply that you fail to realize actually it's in the end it's quite simple, and it's the kind of truth a 3-year-old can grasp, but it's the kind of truth that can keep the greatest sages of this world, entranced with the mystery and awesomeness of. And I do think in the end, when Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me," it's to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs. There's something childish about ultimately yielding, surrendering to God, and that can be very difficult, I think, for someone who is, inevitably has built their sort of platform and identity on being a kind of an intellectual. I don't know. I suspect with Jordan Peterson, I really value, the way in which he has opened that door, as I said, to a lot of young men. But I think, I guess for me, the important thing in the end, and I think he's come very close at various points, is to recognize that ultimately, the ultimate reality is centered in a person, Jesus Christ. And that can have all kinds of interesting manifestations, all of these psychological significances in all kinds of ways. And I suppose my wonder at the moment is whether he's still at that position where he has an enormous reverence for Jesus. He sees Jesus as this extraordinary archetype of love, justice, suffering, sacrifice, redemption. But as long as Jesus remains that archetype, he's still secondary to something else, be it, you know, ultimately nature or Jung's kind of, you know, stratification of this stuff or whatever. And I want him to see that Jesus isn't the archetype. Jesus is the grounding of it all, you know, the reality upon which all these other archetypes exist. And I'm not sure he's quite there yet. And I'm not sure what will bring him to that point. Interestingly, a number of people around him have come to that point. Probably not through quite such a winding intellectual journey either, but his wife, you know, Tammy Peterson, has become a very devout Catholic now. His daughter, Michaela, has become a Christian. And he obviously has surrounded himself with many Christian, you know, really orthodox Christian thinkers. So I'm not quite sure, you know, what it would take for him to finally, you know, say yes. Yeah.
Okay, so this next question is from Donna, who is here with us. You say that the church should be willing to be risk being weird once more. Actually, I believe Tom Holland said that, but you agree with him. What is one weird thing you would like the church to start doing or emphasizing?
That's a great question. I think the church should get back to emphasizing that prayer changes things. And I think in many parts of the church, we've downplayed the weirdness of that, that we live in a sort of spiritual war zone in that sense. And I think it's time to really lean into that, because there is a place for, you know, intellectual debate, and I've been in that space for a long time myself. And there is a place for having cultural conversations and debates and so on. But there's something very countercultural, very weird about, in this day and age, people just stopping everything and praying, because we live in a culture which is so focused on results and, you know, the utility of everything, that for someone to just stop and do something which on the face of it looks like it has absolutely no utility whatsoever, I think is quite a remarkable thing. And even the idea that there are some people who devote themselves to this day and night, you know, that is a very weird thing in the world today. And yet the Christian claim is that it's probably the most important thing you could do in your day. And it has more effect than all of the articles and videos and podcasts and everything else that you could spend your life creating and putting out into the world. And that's a challenge to me. You know, I've never been very good at praying, but I've felt challenged as I've written this book and this podcast series, and more seeing the way in which the part of this surprising rebirth is actually people coming back to seeing the world again as enchanted and as this spiritual war zone, as I say, that there really is a battle between good and evil. I've been convicted that actually we need to pray more. And so for me, that would be something that I would encourage the church to really lean into. Get your people praying.
I think we forget how weird it is. I come from a family of all atheists. I'm the only believer. I have 5 siblings, and they all think I'm nuts. And you know, they mock the phrase thoughts and prayers. You know, like, it's just inconceivable. It's like wishful thinking to them. They just don't, you know, get it. So it is weird. It is weird to many people.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, if that, sadly, that phrase can be thrown around, and I think it does lose its significance when it tends to just get used as a sort of thing to put out on social media, and you know the person probably isn't doing that much thinking or praying about the person or the situation. I think though, yeah, I think when we do actually pray, and perhaps we don't broadcast it either, that's actually very powerful. And that's yeah, and I'm glad that that your family think you're nuts in that way. And I think Christians have always been these strange people, it's foolishness to the Greeks, and a scandal to the Jews, and it's a sort of but that is how Christianity, that's been always been part of Christianity's unique power, has been the foolishness and the way in which God uses that foolishness.
The next question is from Gretchen, who has joined us today. And she wants to know, in your own experience, what kind of things do you find yourself talking about with others to reach them with the message of Jesus?
Just repeat the question again. Sorry, just so.
In your own experience, what kinds of things do you find yourself talking about with others to reach them with the message of Jesus?
So is the question sort of what are the particular things from my own experience that I tend to bring into a conversation that might help people kind of understand the gospel and that sort of thing?
Gretchen, is
so
that
I-
what you're asking?
It's just basically it's like we've all been taught different methods of evangelism, and I don't know if it's the same way over there, but there's tons of different methods and books and schools and all this stuff.
Okay.
But with all of the insight of this book that was so powerful that you just read, it seems as if you're presuming that there's a different way that we can reach reach people with ultimately the salvation message of Christ, but that it may look really different than all the methods that we've been taught in and trained in. And I'm just curious, in your own life, what does that look like for you?
I do understand now. Thank you. That was really helpful clarification. Yes, I mean, I'm not against there being helpful tools and ways of having that conversation. And there are lots of examples where that's been really helpful and fruitful for people. I do think sometimes by simply applying one method only, you can also miss people for whom that isn't going to make sense, and they're coming at life in a different way and so on. Honestly, I would say my approach to evangelism is simply trying to get to know someone, first of all, getting a sense of what fires them, as I said earlier, what their passions and that sort of thing are, and hopefully having a genuine conversation before trying to sort of, come to a sort of move them in the direction, if you like, of Christianity. And to that extent, but I do, and again, the approach I take will differ very much depending on the person, as we were saying, whether it's the atheist, the postmodern person, the Bible scholar, whatever. There's going to obviously be a little bit of differences to how that conversation goes. In the end, what I'm probably most likely to encourage them to do is to sort of, kind of apply sort of a modern day Pascal's wager of we'll give it a try. Try going to church, try praying, try reading the Bible, try opening yourself up and ask God to reveal himself to you in some way. If I can get to that point, now obviously that may be some way down in the conversation because most people aren't going to be sort of ready to receive that immediately. But what I'm, I think, most often keen to encourage people to do is to actually step in and give it a go. I was at dinner just last week with a young guy sort of in his early 20s who was talking about the fact that he was, feeling quite drawn towards, he wanted something, and he sort of had a sort of vague belief in God. And I was, and it was a wonderful opportunity to kind of clear up one or two sort of misconceptions I think he had about what Christianity is, and just to very simply sort of spell out the idea that ultimately it's not about us working our way towards God, but God has reached down to us. And it was a wonderful, constructive conversation. And I was encouraging him. A great next step would be to go on an Alpha course. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Alpha course, but they're quite common here. Lots of churches run them. And I said, that's a great place to explore that. I wasn't sort of there and then. My style isn't to kind of push for like the sinner's prayer at that point. Now, I was next to someone else who was also a Christian when we were both having the conversation, but his style was, well, look, you could make the decision tonight. Actually, you could say yes to Jesus. And I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? Actually, he's probably right. Maybe I should have a bit more courage to sort of say, well, this is a guy who's kind of open, and this might be his moment. And yes, it would still make a lot of sense to go on that Alpha course, but why not challenge him if it feels like there's an openness. So that was a learning moment for me, because I'm always very much sort of, because I think I so often deal with people who are so far from that place. I think it opened my eyes to the fact that actually there's probably more people than you realize who could make that step. But as I say, I think different people will sort of have slightly different ways of when's the right time to make to kind of seal the deal, as it were, in a kind of way. And there are inevitably going to be people for whom they just have a lot of those intellectual questions that sort of, to some extent, need to be sorted through before they feel they can arrive at that point. None of that's probably very helpful for your question. I apologize, Gretchen, but I suppose the takeaway is I don't tend to engage any specific formula. I just try to hopefully take that person on a journey where I can hopefully explain why I think Christianity makes sense of them and can speak to their circumstances. And yeah, as when the time is right, encourage them to make a commitment to start doing something that where they can actually start to go on a journey.
That's interesting. You mentioned Alpha. Our church is big on Alpha. Been doing it for decades now. And our youth pastor actually went over to London and met with Nikki Gumbel. And apparently we had one of the largest groups, like something like 500 high schoolers.
Wow.
I mean, everybody in the youth program was inviting everybody in their class, and people were showing up. You know what I mean? So it was crazy.
Yeah.
So we're at the end of our time here. I just want to close with one last question. What future topics or guests are you most excited about doing on your podcast next? Or maybe future plans for a book, or what's in your future?
Yeah. Well, the next book is already in the works, and it's a revised and updated edition of my first book, which was called Unbelievable: Why After 10 Years of Talking with Atheists I'm Still a Christian. It's a lot of it is the similar material, but as I say, to some extent rewritten, an extra chapter, that kind of thing. So look out for that in April or May next year. The book after that,
years while I'm still a Christian.
yeah, exactly. Well, the title has changed to Why I'm Still a Christian.
Oh, okay.
That is the title now. I haven't put any specific time frame on it any longer. Yes, another book will be forthcoming at some point after that, but I'm really not sure what that will be. I've sort of had some vague thoughts about maybe leaning into this whole keep Christianity weird thing, because I think there's a lot of interest in that, and that might be a fruitful direction to go. As it stands, we're working hard on season 2 of the podcast series at the moment. So I can already tell you there's going to be episodes, including an event that I was at recently with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, which will be interesting to put out there.
That'd be great, because you missed having her in your book by this much.
I did, yes. Her story just sort of came out just a couple of months after I published the book. But I'm going to be covering, I think, just a lot of interesting issues that have been bubbling up in light of this thesis. One of them is one I mentioned today, what I see is this male identity crisis, especially among young men, and the way that I think that's meaning a lot of them are actually looking for that identity now in traditional faith, traditional religion. We're going to be looking at the fact that a lot of these characters, as I've already said, are quite conservative leaning. So we're going to be asking, is this Rebirth right wing? And looking at that whole aspect of it, which is very interesting in light of the US election of a couple of weeks ago. And then, yeah, lots of other, as I say, I'm planning a whole episode looking at the sort of supernatural, the return of the supernatural, the fact that I think people are actually becoming far more open to angels, demons, the growth of all kinds of esoteric religious practices on social media and things like that. I think there's a really interesting episode there in the rebirth of our belief in the supernatural. So anyway, those are some of the things to look forward to.
All right, interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us all the way across the pond. So we appreciate your time, and we enjoyed your book quite a bit. Ladies, thank you to Justin Brierley.
Thank you.
And
thank you, everybody. Well, thank you, everyone. Lovely to meet you all. God bless you, and thank you so much for choosing the book as a book to look through, and God bless you all.
All right. Well, thank you, ladies, for being here.
Thank you. See you soon.